So one of the things we want to ask everybody to do is to take your cell phone out. Take your cell phone out. Don't be afraid to take your cell phone out in church. You know, one of the things that we're trying to do here at Columbine is we're trying to move us as a congregation to be a social media conscious congregation. We're working really hard on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter, and we want you to do the same. You know, a lot of times when people take their phones out in church, we think they're playing games or doing something silly. What we want you to do is, no, take your phones out and do something serious. You look up a scripture passage, take notes, take a picture, tweet out something. Heather told me this past week that she posted something on Instagram and it contacted an older member of Columbine, a former member of Columbine, who now lives in Texas. She goes, "That's my church. I love my church." And so we're kind of extending the reach of Columbine out into other people. We want to give a huge welcome to all the virtual members of Columbine United Church. It is great to have you here, Worldwide Communion Sunday. Those of you from literally around the world, some of you here in Denver, but you couldn't make it to church today, but you want to catch up on what's going on. It's great to have you, and especially our men and women in uniform. It's awesome to have you with us. We want you to remember that we always love you and care about you. Let's give these people a warm Columbine welcome. Our scripture passage this morning comes to us from Matthew's Gospel, the 25th chapter, verses 31 through 40. Listen for God's words that comes to us today. This is Jesus talking. Jesus says, when Son of Man, finally arrives, blazing in beauty, and all his angels with him, the Son of Man will take his place on his glorious throne. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort the people out, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting sheep to his right and goats to his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Enter, you who are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation. And here's why. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me." Then the sheep are going to say, "Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you?" Then the king will say, "I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me." And here the passage ends, and may God bless these words as I seek to apply them to our lives. Discovering happiness through compassion. Happiness through compassion. Well, today is Worldwide Communion Sunday. For me, this is a huge thing. You know, on the first Sunday of the month, we always take communion. Actually, every Sunday here at Columbine, we take communion. You come forward, and we have the communion set up here on the two tables. First service is just one table. And on your own, you take the bread, you take the cup, you eat it, and then you light a candle, go back on the side. And what we've realized is that this is a significant part of our life together. At Columbine, periodically we think, should we take that out? And because it allows more time during the worship service, and we always come back saying, no, it's such an important part of your life, of our worship life together. So we always decided to keep it in there. But on the first Sunday of the month, we always do communion in a much more formal way. We have the communion trays, we have the communion table set up, we do what is called the words of institution. So it's much more a formal way of doing communion. But then on the first Sunday of October is always worldwide communion. And this means that literally Christians from around the world, nations around the world, come together to take communion. And I find this very significant. I find this significant because usually we're divided, we're separated by national boundaries, by race, by all these different things that separate us. And as Christians, what we do today is we remember something that unites us together. And I love that. I find it significant that we at Columbine are joining with people around the world. And I started thinking, if I could wish two things for people around the world as they take communion, what would be my wish for them? And I decided my first wish for them is that they would discover happiness. It's something that we've been talking about this whole fall. Wouldn't it be great if everybody around the world decided that they were going to become a happy person, a person full of joy, a person full of optimism and hope? Wouldn't the world change if everybody felt that way about their life? Do you feel that way about your life? Do you consider yourself a happy person, a hopeful person, an optimistic person, a joyful person? Do you live this in such a way that people will see this radiate out about you? Because if people see that you're happy, you know what happens? Happiness is contagious. And they see somebody else being happy, and it encourages them to open up and be happy as well. And maybe as you take communion today, you can pledge yourself to be a happy person. The other thing I wish people would discover today as they take communion is, what does it mean to be a compassionate person? A compassionate person. Wouldn't the world change if everybody acted in a compassionate way? If they made a pledge, a promise, as they took communion, to be compassionate. So, for me, it begs the question, are you compassionate? Do you know what it means to be compassionate? Are you willing to set aside your agenda, your day timer, to act in such a way that you bring compassion to other people? Are you a compassionate person? As you take communion today, can you make a pledge to being compassionate? Because here's the interesting thing. If you want to be happy, you need to be compassionate. The two go hand in hand. But the one leads to the other. Happiness is not something that you keep to yourself. Happiness is something that you share with other people. And when you share it through compassion, it has this reciprocal nature that it comes back to you in the form of happiness. All this fall, I'm preaching out of this book, or following this book called The Book of Joy, Lasting Happiness in a Changing World, featuring Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. Jane turned me on to this book this past summer when I was on sabbatical. And I loved the book so much that I wanted to preach on it throughout the fall. And several of you have mentioned that you've already gotten the book and you're reading the book along with me. It's a great read. It changed me, and so I'm hoping that it changed you. And one of the things that Dolly and Desmond talk about, I love this picture. The two of them jiving it up. They're getting ready. The Dalai Lama is not ever supposed to dance as part of his vows to be the Dalai Lama, but not Desmond Tutu. He's in there dancing, and so he got the Dalai Lama up, and Dolly's going, well, I'm not sure, but he got him moving. It's kind of funny. I love it. But what they talk about is that there are 8 pillars of joy that we need to practice in our life if we're going to discover happiness. There are 8 things that we need to be doing. And throughout the fall, I'm just going to cover some of these basic 8 things. And one of the pillars that they talk about is the pillar of compassion. That if you want to be a happy person, you need to celebrate compassion. You need to practice compassion. And what the Dalai Lama talks about in the book is that every single major world religion talks about compassion. It is a major theme. Every single great teacher of the different religions talks about the need to be compassionate. Jesus, or the Buddha talked about, in the book, the Dalai Lama describes that the Buddha said that there is one virtue that contains all the other virtues, and that's compassion. That if you really want to be a faithful person, lead a faithful life, then you need to understand what it means to live in a compassionate way. Compassion is the core of Jesus' teachings. All of his teachings in some way, shape, or form wrap back to compassion. Think about the 2 great commandments. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's that loving neighbor, that sense of being compassionate. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan is going down the road. He gets beat up. The Jewish person gets beat up, and it's a Samaritan who comes down, sets aside his agenda, takes care of the Jewish person who's in the ditch, pays for his well-being. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. That's what it means to be a neighbor, that sense of compassion. And that's why I chose the scripture passage that I read this morning that I want us to think about on Worldwide Communion Sunday, because it's ultimately a story about compassion. Just let me briefly kind of recap the story. The Son of Man comes again. So it's a metaphor. Jesus is coming again. And he says when the Son of Man comes again, he's going to separate the world into 2 camps, the sheep and the goats. The sheep enter into God's eternal presence, their eternal rest. The goats are separated out from God. Now remember, This is a metaphor. It's a story. I don't literally believe that there's going to be some that are separated into hell and some that are going to be saved, but it's a metaphor that Jesus uses kind of as a teaching analogy. And so he says to the sheep, "Sheep, welcome into my eternal rest." And the sheep go, "Why us? Why us?" And Jesus said, "Well, because I was hungry, you fed me. I was naked, you clothed me. I was homeless, and you sheltered me. I was sick and in prison, and you visited me." And they said, "When did we do these things?" And Jesus said, "Whenever you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it to me." The key is they had no idea what they were doing. They were just motivated by it. Whereas by the goats, why were the goats separated? Because they didn't do those things. They didn't feed Jesus. And the goat said, "But if we knew that it was you, we would have fed you." And Jesus says, that's the key. The key is that you don't really need to know that it's me. It just needs to be who you are. It needs to be how you act. It needs to be your way. Of course, if we knew it was Jesus, we would take care of him. But instead, it needs to be this way of living. You need to be compassionate people. And if we ever think about what it means to follow Jesus, to be his disciples, to be a child of God, and how do we act that out in the world, we act it through compassion. We act it through compassion. Now, I have preached on this sermon, this topic, probably 10 or 15 times throughout my career. And I always kind of preach on the same way about how to live to be a sheep, how to live to be a sheep. And late last night when I was writing this sermon, I thought to myself, right before I went to bed, I said, this is boring, 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 boring. And I hate to preach boring sermons. I grew up listening to boring sermons. I hate boring sermons. So I said, I don't want to preach a boring sermon. In the middle of the night, I got up and I said, this sermon just sucks. It doesn't work. And so I got up at 5 o'clock and I said, there's got to be a better way to make the point about what it means to be a compassionate person. And so this thought came to my mind to tell the story about my wife. Now, she has no idea. That's just go ahead and, no, don't edit that out. But I'll tell her not to watch the video this week. Because, here's the fun thing. So many of you will never know my wife. She is my upfrontedness, my out loudness, my extrovertedness. She is the exact opposite of that. She is quiet. She likes to be behind the scenes. She slips in, she slips out. She never makes a big deal about herself. But for me, my wife is my hero. She is my hero. She is a psychotherapist, and she specializes in working with people who are victims of severe trauma. She especially works with children who are victims of severe trauma. She has this huge respect to people in the metro area because of her work. And if you ever see people on the news that have been victims of trauma and there's children involved, my wife more than likely will be the therapist for those kids. So I really respect my wife's work. She deals with the hardest stuff in the world, working with these kids. But the other thing I like about my wife is that I would consider her to be a sheep. There's just a part of her that compassion just flows out of her. And I want to tell you a story that my wife told me from last spring. So this is not a picture of my wife. But it's the best I could find at 5 o'clock. Because the story is that last spring, in one of those late snowstorms that we had, she was going down Bellevue Avenue, and when all of a sudden she saw a guy in one of these electric wheelchair carts who was stuck in the middle of Bellevue. And it was snowing and people were driving by. And she said, oh my gosh, he's got his chair high centered, he's stuck. We got to help him get out of the road. And so she pulls up on a side street and she goes running out in traffic. My first thought is, that's dangerous in the middle of a snowstorm, Bellevue Avenue. But, her point is, someone's got to do something. Someone's got to do something. So she got behind this guy, and she started pushing and pushing to get this guy high-centered off his chair. And she starts moving. And as she's moving, suddenly other people are stopping. And they're saying, can I help? Can I help? Can I help? And because she's helping, somehow it reminds them that they need to help. And together they get this guy off to the side of the street. Now, Maybe it doesn't sound like much. Maybe it's just a story. But when she came home and told me the story, she was kind of glowing. She was excited that she was able to help this person. But more importantly, she said, first of all, I was amazed at the number of people who were just driving by this guy in the middle of Bellevue Avenue. She said, but then I was really inspired when other people stopped to help. She goes, what is it about human beings that they need to see another person act in compassionate ways for them to be compassionate? And I love that. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And for me, that story has just hung with me about how important it is to be a compassionate person. And now, was she feeding, clothing, sheltering, visiting? No, she wasn't. But doesn't it kind of get at the root maybe of what it means to be a sheep? Not to say that those other things aren't important. I'll talk about it in just a moment. But it needs to talk about something about what it means to be just a compassionate person. Because I see like there's three great truths that kind of pop to me from this story. The first truth that I take from it is that compassion sometimes is just thrust upon us. And we have to be willing and ready to act in compassionate ways. We all have our day timers, we all have our schedules, we have the things that we'd like to do. But like the parable of the Good Samaritan, sometimes these things are just thrust upon us, and you have to act. You can't let these opportunities go by. You can't be like the person who drives by on Bellevue Avenue. You have to be able to stop, take your time, and help, because that's what your faith requires of you. That's what Jesus requires of you. It's what it means to be a faithful disciple. Now, sometimes it can be simple things. This is one of the things, my wife does two things that always inspires me. I can never remember to do it. She goes to Starbucks, and she buys the Starbucks for the person behind her. Just out of the blue, she buys them. She goes to the grocery store, and she buys the groceries for the person behind her. For me, she's one of the most generous person. I always think, when I hear that, I kind of go, oh, wow. And I'm usually so groggy when I get to Starbucks. I just want my own coffee, let alone thinking about the guy behind me. Why can't we think about the guy behind us? Why can't we think about the person who needs something that we have and we can give it to them? We need to act in compassionate ways. For me, I want to call that the compassion compulsion. The compassion compulsion, to act in a certain way. And it happens in all different aspects of our life. Like, think about this one. You're coming down to an intersection, and there is somebody standing with a sign. Now, for the most part, I don't know about you, but when I hit those people, I go, I don't want to be seen. They come walking up the road with their sign, and I don't want to be seen. Because I don't want them knocking on my window asking for money. But yet every time I do, I feel this, what can I do? What can I do? Because I feel as though I should. Periodically, I do hand out a $5. Other times, what I can do is that every single time, what I can do for them? I can pray. I can pray for them. I can offer a smile, a wave. One of the things that Danny was at, Danny Way, our youth and children's ministry, was at the 8 o'clock service. And I told Danny, you got to do those bags that we put together for the homeless people that have socks, toothbrush, toothpaste, underwear, those kind of things that you can actually hand these people. It's a great thing to keep in your car, so you actually are doing something for somebody. Russ, who's at the 8 o'clock service, talked about that he would buy those bags and he would hand the bags out to people who are on the corner, and they always said, God bless you. Now, should you do these things? Should you respond to someone who is in need? And it's kind of a dicey thing. I get that, because when you're giving $5 to a person on the corner, is it really doing good? I'll never forget, we had somebody from the Action Center here several years ago and doing kind of a dialogue sermon with me, and I asked the question, what do we do? Is that a good thing to do or not? And she said, well, it's a debate, among those of us who work with homeless people. Is that doing good or not doing good? However, she said, never go beyond or forget or ignore, that's the right word, ignore your compulsion to be compassionate. Always pay attention to that. Because I think when we pay attention to it, we stay open to it. We stay open to it. I think it's that practicing compassion. Are you practicing compassion? Because really what it does is hold on, I'm not there yet. Remember, it's 5 o'clock. Give me a break. It teaches us how to be compassionate and brings us to a sense of happiness. When my wife told me the story, she was glowing. She had a sense of happiness, a sense of satisfaction, a sense of hope about her. She was happy. Now, sometimes being compassionate is just not your own individual action. Sometimes to respond takes a huge effort. Consider Puerto Rico. Consider Puerto Rico. Consider Houston. Consider Louisiana. Consider Florida. These big things happen, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. And we think about teenage suicide here in our own community. That suicide is now the leading cause of death among teenagers. And I read that in Colorado, it's spiking. It's spiking the number of teenage suicide. And we sit here and we think, oh my gosh, what can we do? Me as an individual, I don't feel like I can do a whole lot. That's why we have these 15 mission agencies that we support here at Columbine. Because Matthew 25 says feed, clothe, shelter, visit. And each one of these just a few that I threw up. The Action Center here in Jefferson County, El Porvenir. We need to bring water to people in Nicaragua. This is one that's really close to me. I've been down there. You alone can't do it, but an organization like El Porvenir can do it. Second Wind Fund, Teenage Suicide, Bessie's Hope. Bessie's Hope is this organization that helps bring people together to visit the nursing homes in our area. And with a mother-in-law who lives in assisted living, I can tell you there's a boatload of people who never have a single visit. And they've been basically forgotten by our community. UMCOR. You've heard us talk about UMCOR. That this is the United Methodist Committee on Relief. We support the Presbyterian disaster response. We support the United Church of Christ disaster ministries. And these are the things these agencies that go in to the Puerto Ricos, the Houstons, and the Florida. And they're actually boots on the ground Christians who are really bringing relief to these different organizations. Habitat for Humanity. Hopefully you know about Humanity. Comes out there with Habitat for Humanity. Ta-da! She's got that fashionable helmet. Our build is October 21st. We need 8 people. We have 2 sign up, right? So we need 6 more. So we have these set up in Beale Hall, and after worship, we want you to go in there and have breakfast, a free breakfast. Talk about a bribe. We want you to go and have a free breakfast, but more importantly, we want you to go and see all the different mission agencies that we support, because literally every single dollar that you give to the church, a portion that goes to these agencies. And again, why? Because we want you to be sheep. We want you to participate. We want you to go beyond your calendars. You can sign up to volunteer for these agencies. It's how you fulfill Matthew 25. Are you being sheep? The last great insight that I have from my wife's story is that it unleashes compassion. When you act in compassionate ways, it releases compassion in other people. It's interesting that it took her taking a risk, getting out in Bellevue, pushing a cart that got other people to stop. And Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu talk about this in the book, that there's something about the human psyche that knows we're supposed to be compassionate. They talk about the fact that we're hardwired to be compassionate, but things get in the way, our schedules or whatever get in the way. And sometimes we need to see other people act compassionately to remind us that we need to act compassionately. I don't know why that is. It should be just who we are. But sometimes we need to be people who are living reminders. Can you be a living reminder? Can you unleash compassion? At the 8 o'clock service, we did communion. And sometimes you're really funny. You're really funny because you need to tell me things that happen. You need to tell Jane and I things that happen in the middle of taking communion. I think this is funny. Barb Enzor, she's taking communion at 8 o'clock, and she goes, "Oh, I can't wait to tell you. I got to tell you." I go, "Barb, we're taking communion. You got people behind you." She goes, "No, I want to tell you about a story." She goes, "I was at Sweet Tomatoes over here at Sweet Tomatoes, and somebody bought my lunch for me. And so, you know what I did? I bought the lunch of the person behind me. Well, then that person bought the lunch for the person behind him. And it just kept on going, and everybody was buying lunch for each other. And I thought, that's it. That's it. You unleash compassion in other people when you act in compassionate ways. And don't you know, at Sweet Tomatoes, they had a little party of some kind. Everybody was smiling. You know they were. Why? Because they were feeling happiness at the depth of their being. Happiness in the depth of their being. And I think that's the cool thing about when you act in compassionate ways, you discover happiness. Don't you want to be a happy person? I want to be a happy person. But what my wife teaches me, what hopefully I teach you, hopefully what you teach other people, hopefully what you teach your kids. I love that song that we opened with. I hope. You know, and one of the key things is that our children are watching us. You know, we teach compassion by how we act, and we teach compassion to our children. That brings a sense of happiness. So here we are. Worldwide Communion Sunday. People coming from all over to take communion. You are going to come and take communion. I wonder if you can make a pledge as you take communion, as you take the bread that represents the brokenness of the world, that you take the cup, which represents God's abiding hope for the world, the cup of salvation. If you can take these things and make a pledge to be his faithful disciple. Don't just come up here and take communion, pop a bread, pop a cup of juice, go sit down. Cheers to Jesus. I don't know why I just said that, but I guess it worked. Why do they let me do these things sometimes? I have no idea. All right. I'll go back. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Give me a break. I know. That you do so with intentionality. You think about when you take the bread, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be his disciple. I'm making a promise. I'm going to act in compassionate ways. Because what our faith tells us is that it's our responsibility. We are sheep in the world acting with compassion. And then through compassion, discover happiness.